I'm Bill Potter. I have the privilege to both be the Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar Professor of Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, and also the director of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. The last two times I appeared in a large auditorium in Monterey to conduct a conversation of this sort were with then IAE Director Mohammad El-Baradei before he received the Nobel Peace Prize, and with then Russian Ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak, before he became a household name and a subject for TV skits on Saturday Night Live. I don't want to suggest that my conversations had anything to do with their subsequent celebrity status, but our very distinguished guest this evening is forewarned. More seriously, I would note that we have been fortunate to host some of the most acclaimed diplomats, state and national government officials, and heads of international organizations at MIS, including the heads of every international organization with responsibilities in the non-proliferation and disarmament arena. One of them, IAEA Director General Yukiya Amano, even served for a period of time as a diplomat in residence at CNS. Our guest this evening, however, is truly one of our own, an alumna, an artist, a former deputy foreign minister, her country's ambassador to international organizations in Geneva, and most recently, the president of the UN conference that negotiated a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Before I give Ambassador Elayne Whyte the floor, and prior to the conversation that we'll be conducting this evening, I'd like to invite Ms. Professor Jan Black to come to the podium to briefly share some of her recollections about our guest when she was still a graduate student at MIS. Jan will speak for a few minutes, and then Ambassador Whyte will share with you some prepared remarks. We'll then have a conversation, and then we'll conclude with plenty of time for a Q&A period, following which we will have a reception upstairs that will be hosted by Dr. Jeffrey Dayton Johnson. So that's the plan for this evening. I think you will enjoy it. And so why don't we get started? Jan, why don't you come up here, and hopefully the mic will continue to function, please.
Is it continuing to function? Good. Okay. I know we have all become accustomed to living in interesting times, in the sense of the Chinese irony, you know. We're not accustomed to living in interesting times in a positive sense. But what our guest tonight has brought to us is absolutely a diplomatic miracle. It's the sort of thing that I think Joe Biden might have called a big fracking deal. And I would not have imagined, I would never have expected to see in my lifetime a United Nations treaty straightforwardly prohibiting nuclear weapons. That's just really something. But what I wasn't surprised about in this was who brought this about. You know, Elayne was never able to surprise me about things like that. A quarter of a century ago, Elayne came to study here at the Monterey Institute at the same time that I came to teach. She was one of my best students then, and we have ever since been best friends. And she's an amazing woman, a si se puede kind of woman. She, you know, was just about 5 years out of graduate school when she was in the Foreign Service in Costa Rica, and a couple years more she was the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, breaking all kinds of records, certainly the youngest person who had ever been in that role and the first woman in that role. And she didn't wait around for the next woman in that role to do something about women's rights. She went right ahead and pushed or helped to push through legislation prosecuting sexual harassment, which, you know, a very important issue now. And at the same time, she set up a kind of international platform, a panel for parity for women in international affairs. And, you know, she's done many things like this in between. I won't go into her her diplomatic career anymore, because she can tell you about that, and she can tell you about the amazing treaty that she's just put through. I'll just tell you a little bit about when she was a student. For one thing, for an economics student, she was an amazing dancer, a really fabulous dancer. And she had a dancing partner who was also a fabulous dancer, and one of my favorite students. And this was also exciting for me. I kind of kept waiting for wedding bells, and you know, I finally figured out that they were just best friends, you know. But the wonderful thing about this is that they're still best friends, and it must be a wonderful kind of power pack for Central American diplomacy, because her partner, her dancing partner, Werner Romero, has been in Foreign Service for El Salvador about as long as Elayne has been in for Costa Rica. And he was recently representing El Salvador in the UK and Israel. And and they stay in very close touch, and I can just imagine that he's doing cartwheels right now about this treaty as I am. I'll just drop one more thing that I think Jeff mentioned in passing, but Elayne is becoming a graphic artist now. She's working particularly in watercolor, and I'm imagining hanging her paintings on the wall beside her treaties, and maybe one of these days beside her Nobel Peace Prize. Nothing would surprise me. But anyway, wherever she goes with it from here, I know that she will be setting new standards and better standards for what diplomacy should be and can be. And with that, I will turn the rest over to her and let her tell you how she's done this.
Thank you.
Well, hello everybody. I am very, very happy to be back home. Actually, many years ago, I used to sit in one of those seats. It was, yes, actually 24 years ago that I left Monterey and Nice with my heart full of dreams. We wanted to change the world, and we believed that the sky was the limit. And people used to tell us about that. At that time, the pendulum of history was supposedly replacing geopolitics by geoeconomics, or so they told us. National and global policy dialogues revolved around the commercial blocks, the investment, public sector reform, efficient markets, privatization, economic growth, and trade. And I was ready to engage in development policies and regional economic integration mechanisms within that context of the new global agenda dominated by the globalization talk. And I did. But today I return with great joy to share with my alma mater a very significant event that happened this year and in which, thanks to life, I was directly engaged, which is the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons by the United Nations, 72 years after the advent of the nuclear age. As a former student of this institution, I hope that my experience will be an important motivation for this academic community. And I want to thank the support that I received as a president of that negotiation process from the Institute and by CNS, also through Dr. Potter.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, on December 10th, 2017, in Oslo, Norway, for the fourth time in history, the Nobel Committee will award a Nobel Peace Prize to an organization working towards the abolition of nuclear weapons. But it is for the first time that this award is accompanied or preceded by a historic milestone. Indeed, it was 122 countries of the international community that decided to adopt a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons and invites the nuclear states to become state parties to the treaty and undertake their disarmament processes within the legal obligations of the instrument. Just to cite a fact, you might have read the editorial of the New York Times in October this year that reviewed the U.S. nuclear arsenal and created the awareness in the public that with this arsenal, one could kill or make disappear a quarter of the population of China, Russia, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Libya, and DPRK, and still would have 2,897 warheads out of the 15,000 warheads, nuclear warheads that exist, which we know is enough to destroy the world and humanity several times. And this is the reason why when I visited Nagasaki in April of this year and met the mayor of Nagasaki, he asked me to convey to the conference and to the delegations a special request. He said to me, you know, the Ibakushas, that's the survivors of the atomic bombings, they are getting very old and they are suddenly and slowly, put it that way, slowly disappearing. Please make that treaty become a reality before the last one of them leaves the earth. So let me recall that the struggle to abolish nuclear weapons actually began the day after the nuclear detonations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The international community of the Red Cross itself sent a communication to its chapters around the world reporting on the terrible events and questioning from that moment on this type of weapons of mass destruction that are against the principles of international humanitarian law. Just to cite the main, the principles of proportionality, the principle of distinction between combatants and civilian population, and the principle that the right to choose the means of warfare is not unlimited, but it is constrained by other legal norms that international society has been building for many years to regulate the behavior of state in the conduct of hostilities. These efforts were also accompanied by the scientific community. Just to cite an example, Albert Einstein started back in 1946 the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, through which scientists that had previously been involved in the Manhattan Project, that after an investment of $1 billion of the 1940s, you can help us as an economist to make the projection of how much that will mean today. They were able to develop the bomb, and they engaged to educate the public about the dangers associated with the development of nuclear weapons and promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Einstein proclaimed that when it came to nuclear weapons, I open quote, "There is no possibility of control except through the aroused understanding and insistence of the peoples of the world. We believed," he said, "that an informed citizenry will act for life and not death." End of quote. That same year, the issue of nuclear disarmament received special consideration by the United Nations. But some months before, in 1945, the issue of disarmament was included at the very foundation of the United Nations. First of all, because the Charter, the UN Charter, was founded, among others, with the aim to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, quoting the Charter, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. So such principles were developed in the very first resolution adopted by the first UN Assembly in 1946, which called precisely to eliminate nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction from national arsenals and to promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And in the 1960s, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons established a great bargain by which all members of the international community would commit not to develop nuclear weapons in exchange for knowledge for peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and in exchange for total nuclear disarmament, because the Article 6 of that treaty establishes the obligation to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. But despite this legal, political, and humanitarian imperative, the pace of nuclear disarmament negotiation and the fulfillment of the NPT treaty obligations has practically stalled since the great accomplishments of that followed the end of the Cold War. And analyzing the institutional framework of the UN, we have to understand that the UN disarmament negotiation body for excellence, the Conference on Disarmament, has been paralyzed for 20 years. It has not been able to agree on a work agenda for 20 years. it is very interesting now that I am in Geneva to attend those meetings and year after year listen to their discussions. And actually, let me just tell you this anecdote because we are just Costa Rica is just an observer state to the Conference of Disarmament. And but anyhow, we have part of the staff that covers disarmament issues. So my instruction to cover the city is go to the first meeting of each presidency, try to look at what they're trying to do, and then go to the last meeting of and see what people say, what are the explanations for why they did not achieve any agreement. And while there is this paralysis of the Conference of Disarmament, we also know that all nuclear states are pursuing a modernization and upgrading of their nuclear arsenals that are estimated, in the case of the U.S., to account to at least $1.2 trillion in the next years. So the international community started to accumulate concerns and frustrations about this lack of progress and this lack of a culture of compliance with treaty obligations. But also science has come into play by contributing with facts that speak of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. A political movement was born, strengthened by the conferences of the humanitarian impact that took place in Oslo, Mexico, and Vienna, the last of which in Vienna already called for the need to fill the legal gap in international law and go ahead and prohibit nuclear weapons. In this context, the United Nations General Assembly decided to act upon and called for the negotiation of the Prohibition Treaty in December. Actually, it was on the 16th of December last year that the negotiation mandate was approved. 7 months later, on July the 7th, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has brought an innovation in the way we approach, discuss, and take action on nuclear weapons that profoundly challenges the nuclear orthodox, departing from a total rejection of this type of weapons as instruments of international security. On the contrary, in the treaty, the 122 states, this is the vast majority of the international community, have stated that the very existence of nuclear weapons poses a threat to humanity and implies risks of use, including any detonation by accident, miscalculation, or design, or intent. Furthermore, any single nuclear detonation, let alone nuclear war, would be incompatible with the dictates of public conscience and the principles of international humanitarian law and human rights law. International law would have catastrophic consequences that cannot be adequately addressed by any single entity. It would transcend national borders and pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, socioeconomic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of present and future generations, and have a disproportionate impact on women and girls and indigenous populations. This is the first time in history that this is included in a legal norm, this categorical rejection and complete change of nuclear weapons from seeing them as an instrument of security to seeing them as an instrument of threat. Any use of nuclear weapons, as the treaty states, is contrary to international law and international humanitarian law. And let us remember that human civilization is built on the common understanding that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, that we are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood, so says the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, any decision, conscious decisions to use nuclear weapons goes actually against the dictates of of human conscience. And so in this school of thought, to completely eliminate such weapons remains the only way to guarantee that they are never, ever, ever used again under any circumstances. It is in the understanding of the scientific facts that prove the catastrophic humanitarian impact of any use of nuclear weapons that the treaty therefore starts with Article 1 prohibiting a wide range of activities related to nuclear weapons, from the development, testing, production, manufacture, possession, stockpiling, to the prohibition to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons. And it also establishes means through which a nuclear state can access the treaty and undertake the disarmament efforts bound by the treaty provisions. This treaty is of a new generation of legal instruments because it contains a structure based on the inclusion of general obligations, and in this case prohibitions, but a flexible scheme for the implementation of the treaty provisions that allows for constant upgrading and evolution of the regime. This is opposed to the traditional way of building legal instruments that are kind of fixed in time, and it is very difficult after the circumstances changes to then go and change the treaty. In this case, the treaty provides for an institutional structure, which is the meeting of state parties that will meet on a regular basis. There we have the possibility to develop instruments or protocols on measures for the verified, timely, and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapon programs, including any additional protocols to the treaty. And at the same time, it is empowered to continue making decisions about aspects of the regime that will need further development, such as the definition of the Secretariat, for instance, treaty bodies to assist in the implementation of the treaty, and the identification or creation of the competent international authority that will be responsible to negotiate with the nuclear states that want to become state parties their plan for the verified destruction of their nuclear arsenals. And this international authority will also have to cooperate for the issues of the verification of the compliance with this legal plan. So the conference of the meeting of state parties can actually take additional measures, both practical and legally binding, where needed, for the irreversible, verifiable, and transparent destruction of nuclear weapons in order to achieve and maintain a world free of nuclear weapons. But there is also innovation in the provisions regarding victim assistance, which is included for the first time in the realm of nuclear weapons. And these provisions are compatible with international human rights law and international cooperation provisions that recognize the responsibility to assist other affected states parties and to implement environmental remediation and cooperation measures when a state uses nuclear weapons before their total destruction. Now, to think about the treaty in terms of its environment, the treaty certainly comes to reinforce the obligations and the norms of non-proliferation and prohibition of nuclear testing. It is part of the disarmament and non-proliferation architecture of the UN, and it complements, above all, the aspiration to reinforce the culture of compliance of legal obligations by collecting and articulating all the aspirations, all the obligations for nuclear disarmament there are in different documents, process, and treaties, and trying to bring them to fruition into one regime. The Prohibition Treaty is an instrument for a world free of nuclear weapons. It takes steps in the course of action already agreed upon by the UN, not only to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, as the UN Charter expressly states. But now let me share some thoughts about some more personal and national experiences in this process. First of all, you can imagine that for any diplomat, for any professional, to be able to contribute with such a groundbreaking process of the international community is, of course, a great deal. Sometimes I need to realize if I'm dreaming or not. And for my country, for Costa Rica, it was a magnificent opportunity to contribute to the United Nations and international law, upon which the country relies its development model. So, in some sort of a way, it is, for Costa Rica, for our society, a way to give back to the international community, just as we have received from the international community security, so that we have been able to develop without having an army. And as this beautiful poem says, bless the Costa Rican mother who knows when she gives birth that her child will never be a soldier. And honestly, I think that Costa Rica was very well positioned to contribute to this process, as I really had the freedom to negotiate as president of the conference on the basis of principle and on the basis of guaranteeing and safeguarding the mandate provided by the General Assembly. Precisely because my country does not have or does not belong to all of these security arrangements. This experience allows me to reflect on several concepts: purpose, hope, fear, and human evolution. I always ask myself, what is the purpose of the work that we undertake every day? And how we relate to those unquestionable truths that lie at the basis of power structures. Do we perceive ourselves as agents of change or continuity? And how do we exert our responsibility towards the world we live in? By improving, strengthening, or drastically changing realities? How do we engage on an everyday basis? I know these are very personal questions. They are very hard to answer, and there is no standard rule that fits everybody. But they are definitely guiding questions for our everyday life. And maybe those can be questions that can follow our moment of waking up every single morning. And as I heard in my commencement speech here in Monterey 24 years ago, follow your heart, if you have any. I think that we always have to blossom. We have to promote change and evolution in a realistic manner, of course, but we have to focus every single day on what we can do to make a difference. small or big, it doesn't matter, but to make a difference, to contribute, to build, to leave a positive legacy, and to contribute to promote positive human evolution. And this brings me to the issue of evolution, because there is nothing permanent in human history. Everything is in constant transition. We all know that. When I was growing up, I thought that the world would always be bipolar, and that the Cold War was always going to be the reality. But when I arrived in Monterey, the Soviet Union disintegrated. So I asked myself in this regard how long the nuclear age will last. And as we are 27 years before we reached 100 years of the birth of the nuclear age, if we take as a basis of the findings of history, we can estimate that the nuclear age will not be permanent and will also pass someday. But when and how is that change going to be achieved? That is the main question that we have to answer ourselves, and how we contribute to that. Will it be peaceful, or will it happen with the destruction of humanity and planet Earth? This is why we have to contribute every step with realism. But ultimately, every achievement lies on the other side of fear. And this is why we always have to cross the bridge, even if we are facing fear. The United Nations General Assembly considered last year, precisely assessing the current international situation, that a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons would be a significant step in the road towards a world free of nuclear weapons, just as the United Nations acted when adopting prohibition norms for slavery, for racial discrimination and apartheid, for cluster munitions, landmines, chemical and biological weapons. So the course of action of adopting prohibition norms is actually already a habit of the international community, a resource of the international community. But at the same time, the General Assembly acknowledged that additional measures after the treaty was adopted, both practical and legally binding, were going to be needed for the irreversible, verifiable, and transparent destruction of nuclear weapons in order to achieve and maintain a world free of nuclear weapons. And this is the reason why we need further political dialogue and citizen engagement. And this is when you perhaps say there is no reason to believe that nuclear weapon states are going to engage in a process of dismantling their nuclear arsenals. But this is when I say that it is especially when we are navigating turbulent waters that we have to walk with hope and act with hope. And for which, to conclude, I would like to recall the words by Václav Havel on hope, which is something that I shared in Nagasaki at the beginning of the year, when we did not know yet if the treaty was going to be achieved. Hope is not a feeling of certainty that everything ends well. Hope is just a feeling that life and work have a meaning. It is not an estimate of the state of the world. It is something that you either have or you don't. Regardless of the state of the world that surrounds you, it is a dimension of human existence. Of course, you can also do without this dimension. But life without hope is an empty, boring, and useless life. I cannot imagine that I can live and strive for something if I did not carry hope in me. And this was the thought that accompanied me in the most difficult moments in the negotiations and accompanied the conference. And this is the reason why I dared at the closure of the first session of the conference to say that we were going to finish by July the 7th, and I kept on saying that until we did achieve the goal. But in coming back home, I also wanted to leave here a piece of this exercise. And this is the reason why I decided to bring a copy of the treaty that can be kept here at the Institute with my thoughts. And I say, when I dedicate the text to Miss, my alma mater, thank you for the wisdom and personal growth that I found at Miss 22 years ago. That's when I started. The teachings on intercultural communication and understanding are at the bottom of the search for peace. Thank you very much. Laura.
Why don't you join me here? So I think that's on. Can you continue? Can you hear me all right with the with this mic in my pocket here? Okay. You may have been deceived by Ambassador Whyte's very calm manner, her very soft-spoken approach. Don't be fooled. Those ambassadors who were in fact mistaken about her soft manner soon found out that she also had an iron fist and used her gavel to very good effect. And so I'll try to bring out some of the toughness in our guest, as well as the very soft-spoken manner that she demonstrated to you just a moment ago. In fact, I want to focus just a little bit on the element of passion, because you talked about both passion and perspective in preparing for the Prohibition treaty negotiations. And I think particularly in your closing remarks, we got a sense of the inner thoughts that helped to guide you. But I thought it might be interesting if you could say a little bit more about the element of passion, and particularly how the Hibakusha, the atomic bomb survivors, helped you during the negotiations, because I know you were really touched by them. You made some reference to your trip to Nagasaki. I know as you looked out during the negotiations, there was at least one individual in particular whom you continually pointed to. Could you say a little bit about kind of the inspiration that you derived from the atomic bomb survivors, Elayne?
Yes, I think, can you hear me? Yes? I found that the presence of the Hibakushas, that of course had been struggling for 7 decades to see nuclear weapons being prohibited in international law, was a very important driving factor, because when you are there with a room full of official delegations that are prepared to deliver official statements that have been very well crafted, very well studied, and you hear a completely different tone. A person who tells the story of where he or she was when the bombings took place and how they saw their relatives dying, and to tell and actually to listen to them break into tears when they tell you all the description of what they lived. It completely completely changes the energy in the room, completely changes the energy. And so, of course, the exercise continues to be a negotiation between states that have interests. But the delegates have a completely different sense of purpose in that exercise. They have a human conviction because they were touched. And the fact that they are there witnessing all the negotiations actually is like an accountability, permanent accountability process, and they know they cannot fail. They cannot look into the eyes of Aníbal Kush and say, we did not achieve the treaty. And so that made the whole process a very constructive one, although of course there were other factors, more rational factors that we might also address in terms of the interaction between civil society, academia, and the official delegations, and also the contribution by the chair to push through the adoption of the rules of procedure of the conference on the very first day of the conference, which actually it is a very outstanding achievement, considering that most United Nations conference actually get stuck for days discussing the rules of procedure. So I think, of course, those three elements have been vital in understanding the rationale, the reasoning, the rational aspect, as well as the energy that you could feel in the room.
Thanks, Elayne. I'm going to ask a very different kind of a question. I'm going to ask a few more questions just to get us started, then I'm going to ask people to kind of line up behind the mic so that you can ask your own questions. One of my staff members who I sought advice from in terms of the questions that I was going to address observed, I think correctly, that there's a very significant gender imbalance among delegates to UN bodies that deal with nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. And I would be curious to hear from you what impact you think this has on their effectiveness and what might be done to basically address this current imbalance.
Yes, of course, that is a fact. There is a very acute imbalance in the representation, gender imbalance in the representation, especially in the domain of security in general. I would say disarmament, security, and of course nuclear weapons governance. There is a very interesting initiative that started in Geneva called the International Gender Champions. It was called the Geneva Gender Champions. That is a platform that allows countries to make voluntary commitments to achieve gender balances. And one of the aspects in which the countries can make commitments is in the integration of the composition of national delegations to different activities and organizations and conferences. So that is something that must be explored to see if we can further promote that in the security disarmament sphere. I think it will be very important because, of course, que vive la différence. It is very important to have women and men. Each of us bring different traits to any human activity, and when we're dealing with negotiation, I think it is very important to bring new ideas. And when we're dealing with nuclear disarmament, it is even more important to bring new and fresh ideas and ways of negotiating, and actually also hope that things can be changed, and that we are not talking about unquestionable truths, that everything in life can be challenged, and that human progress is the result of constantly challenging those unquestionable truths, and also with scientific knowledge. So to constantly challenge thinking and incorporating scientific knowledge lies at the basis of any human progress, I think.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to ask one last one, and then depending upon what we hear from the crowd, I may have a few more, but I want to give people who have been patiently listening in the audience a chance to take the floor as well. I think as you know, Elayne, and as many of my students whom I see in the audience are aware, that one of my obsessions, I think it's fair to say an obsession over the years, has been trying to get more governments and international organizations to invest in disarmament and non-proliferation education. I would be curious to hear from you as a practicing diplomat, what you believe are the major obstacles to building greater capacity in many countries in the disarmament and non-proliferation area, and how we can overcome these obstacles. I mean, it's not a controversial topic typically. Countries will vote in the General Assembly, they'll vote or throw their support in NPT review conferences behind disarmament and non-proliferation education. But at the end of the day, notwithstanding the 34 recommendations that are generated through the UN system, I'm struck by how little is actually done. And so I would love to hear from you how you think we can do more to assist countries to actually build the capacity to perhaps introduce the kinds of changes that I think we both agree are essential if we're going to move to a world without nuclear weapons and in a secure environment.
I think we need to democratize knowledge, and in that regard, academic institutions in the countries where there is this knowledge tradition are very well positioned to somewhat disseminate that knowledge throughout the academic community around the world. And it will be very interesting to see if through already existing structures that bring together academic institutions around the world, it is possible to introduce the issue of nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation as a point of cooperation and knowledge sharing. I think it is fundamental to work with the academic sector and to try to have, because of course the objective is to educate the public officials, but public officials come and go. It is very important that each society has a reservoir of knowledge, and I believe the best reservoir of knowledge is in the academia. So I think it will be something that to think about how to strengthen some alliances between academia in the first world and in the global south as well, because in the open-ended working group last year in Geneva that took place last year in Geneva, when that was when there was the recommendation sent to the General Assembly to actually agree on this negotiation mandate. It was very interesting for me to see the delegates of many developing nations, of the global south in general, and especially many delegations in Latin America, of Latin American countries, engaging vis-a-vis with the same knowledge basis as countries of NATO countries, or countries that have a very important tradition of knowledge and engaging in military and alliances in nuclear issues. It was very impressive. I was very positively impressed about that growing up of let's say, of many delegations of the Global South. And that's what makes me believe it is the single most important determinant of power and competition in the 21st century is talent, is human talent.
And in fact, kind of a side note to that, what impressed me at the open-ended working group were the number of representatives from many regions, all of whom came under the banner of ICANN. This is the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, which will be receiving a Nobel Peace Prize next week. And whether you agree with what they advocated or not, they were exceptionally effective in providing this kind of grassroots training and bringing these young people to this international conference and interacting with different delegations. And so it was a form of public advocacy that I think was very effective and what is being recognized by the Nobel Peace Prize Committee in Oslo. Okay, why don't, before I ask any more questions, let me suggest that those of you who would like to direct a question to Ambassador Whyte, line up behind the mics and introduce yourself briefly and then ask a brief question. So please line up, and we'll probably alternate back and forth if you'd like to start. I think there's a switch that you need to tap there. Try that.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for being here. And I want to say that I admire Costa Rica tremendously for all they've done in their support for international law. We just viewed a film called A Bold Peace, Costa Rica's path to demilitarization, and it was a remarkable film about all over the years and the treaties that Costa Rica supports that the United States doesn't. So I have a question, and it is in conjunction with something that I had heard had happened, and I didn't hear any mention of the phrase weapons of mass destruction, which of course nuclear weapons are. But the question I have is that at one point there were plans to work to create a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. And I know that Jackie Cabasso, who had spoken here at the panel discussion that was held in October on the passage of the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, she had, I think, been involved with it. But do you think that with this new treaty in place, does that eliminate any possibility of creating zones where there would be eliminating nuclear weapons, say in the Middle East? Would that be something that you think would be off the table now? And then I just want to say one little aside. For those people who are here, our country is going in the opposite direction. We have a modernization plan that's going to put billions of dollars for upgrading our nuclear weapons programs, and I hope that people read up on it because we're very much going in the wrong direction.
Okay, thank you. Elayne, do you want to comment on the issue of nuclear weapons-free zones in general, the WMD-free zone in the Middle East? I'll try not to editorialize here, but go ahead, Elayne.
No, I think the global governance would better be achieved and strengthened by building the norms and the agreements at the global level, and by building implementation structures at the regional level, which is a scheme that has worked in many, many different aspects. So this is to say that I very much believe in nuclear weapon-free zones, regional and sub-regional cooperation and security is something that we build at the regional level. And there are, of course, different layers, and we cannot avoid regional security concerns. And that is the reason why it is obvious that the existence of the Prohibition Treaty by no means would stop the discussion about the negotiation of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, which is a very difficult issue.
Yeah, without going into this issue in any depth, and it's certainly a complicated one, I would not hold much promise, certainly in the short term, for headway on a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. It's not a question of its merits; it's the politics of the issue, and I don't believe that we are likely to witness much headway in the near term. That being said, it's worthwhile to note that just this past February 14th, there was a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, a nuclear weapons-free zone in Latin America and the Caribbean, which actually predates the Non-Proliferation Treaty, at which Elayne and I both had the opportunity to participate. And there has been major progress in the expansion of nuclear weapons-free zones. There are well over 100 states that are parties to zones, but the Middle East is a very, very tough nut to crack, and so I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. I'm going to call on the next two gentlemen. I don't believe they're students, so if there are some students who would like to also ask questions, you're more than welcome to do so. We're trying to emphasize the important role of young people here, and so I would encourage some of you to take the floor. But sir.
Okay, thank you. I am not a student here. First of all,
Could you just mention your name and then ask your question, please?
I'm Dan Presser.
Thank you.
And first of all, I'd like to say there's way too much testosterone out there in your field, and thank you for doing what you're doing. But my question is this: it costs so much money to create a nuclear weapon, and we have several nations that are spending all this money while the people in their countries are going hungry. And there are so many people in India that could use some of that money. There are so many people in Pakistan, not even to mention North Korea. So all this money is being wasted. Can't you approach the problem from an economic point of view and say, hey, this is just beyond belief. Let's start taking care of our people and not blow them up.
Thank you. I think that was an observation and a comment. I don't know if you wish to respond or...
Well, actually, the conference did address the issue of the economic repercussions of nuclear weapons in general, and notes the treaty notes in the preambular section the disproportionate investment and how it competes in terms of resources and the waste of resources they are just taking away from other needs. But it's also very interesting. I've been reading a book lately that analyzes, this is by Jeffrey Sachs, that is analyzing To Move the World, that is analyzing the communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev back in the 60s, and the political discourse in the West and in Russia. And it just amazes me how we are revolving around the same issues. And the concern about the amount of resources that nuclear weapons actually absorb was already back then. So we haven't made that much progress, and that is one of the reasons why there was this movement that wanted to move forward and go ahead and prohibit nuclear weapons as a mean of, taking the issue forward.
Thanks, Elayne. Please, sir.
Hi, my name is Skylar. I'm an education student, actually, but this is one of the joys of MIS. I get to come and check out a non-proliferation talk. And that my question is, you have an artistic and you have a creative side. And I was curious, that doesn't usually come to mind when it comes to non-proliferation and diplomacy. And I was just curious, maybe if you're interested in the arts, if that informs your work in diplomacy, or if that is just an outlet for the work that you do.
Art and painting give me balance, and just and keep me centered. So it is very important when well, of course, at some point in negotiations, people used to tell me, just keep your equanimity. That's the only thing that you have to do, and you're done.
You'd be surprised, though, how many non-proliferation diplomats, in fact, have these artistic skills. I recall, I'll share with you just one anecdote that I suspect only my students probably are aware of. In 2002, there was a very talented Swedish diplomat, Henrik Salander, who was the chair of the preparatory committee. And at the time, there was a new innovation that after the negotiation, the chair was supposed to present his factual summary. And Henrik Salander took the floor as the chair of the conference, brought out his guitar, and began to sing his chair's factual summary. What people didn't realize is that before he became a diplomat, his band had about a half dozen top 10 songs. This is competing with ABBA, mind you. And that started a tradition. The next year there was also a similar kind of a performance. So a number of diplomats have these hidden skills. Dr. Knopf, would you like to ask a question?
Please, thank you, Bill. My name's Jeff Knopf. I'm a faculty member here and serve as the chair of our MA program in Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies. This program didn't exist when you were a student here, but thanks to Bill and others, we now have a specialized master's degree that trains young people in this area. I have a slightly complicated and very sort of insider type of question that I'm sort of personally curious about, so I'll try to articulate it briefly. I'm interested in the relationship between the nuclear ban treaty diplomacy and the views that countries have of NPT Article 6. And in particular, to the extent that you talked about this with the other delegates at the talks, and they articulated their motivations, I'm going to kind of give you what might be a false either-or choice, but tell me if one or the other of these sort of emerged more in your conversations. And we might frame it as, was the motivation one of sort of enforcing compliance, or more one of kind of sort of trying to create and promote a new norm that was seen as not being very strong at the moment? So in other words, one motivation for the talks could be to put pressure on the 5 nuclear weapon states and say to them, if you don't get moving on Article 6, look what's going to happen here. But if the nuclear weapon states made more progress, everyone would be happy to put sort of the ban treaty on the back burner. And I'm thinking of that as kind of the enforcement and compliance track. The other way of thinking about it is that people have more or less just given up. They think that Article 6 is never really going to come to fruition. And so this is more about let's just open up a second diplomatic channel and a different track and try to create and promote a norm that just takes a different channel and is not really about NPT Article 6 anymore. And to the extent that you have a sense of it, was one or the other of these more uppermost in most delegates' minds?
I would say it's more the first approach, but without giving up. I mean, without using the ban treaty as a negotiation token, because there was a complete commitment that that the treaty needed to be in place to complement the architecture. That in this the forest of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, we needed the Prohibition Treaty. But overall, I would say most of the delegations expressed their strong belief that this process was related to, to the implementation of Article 6, mostly, yes.
The other thing, Jeff, just to recall, is that the recommendation to the General Assembly that came out of the open-ended working group came from a body where there were no nuclear weapon states participating. And it was the absence of those nuclear weapon states in part, I think, which was the impetus for those countries to recommend a ban treaty, because they knew that they couldn't negotiate a convention in the absence of the nuclear weapon states, but they could, in fact, proceed with a ban treaty. And so I think had the nuclear weapon states actually participated in the open-ended working group, we might have had a very different kind of an outcome. Please, Tracy.
Hello, Ambassador. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Tracy Lyon. I'm going to take this out. I'm a student in the Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies program here. My question, in a way, complements the previous question. In your statement, you discussed the lack of progress achieved in the Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences with regards to the elimination of nuclear weapons. And you also discussed, in light of the recent treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, the need for dialogue. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, which would be the most productive avenues with which to achieve this dialogue and more progress with regards to the elimination of nuclear weapons amongst the nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapons possessors, which are not party to the NPT?
I think there is a first course of action that we need to undertake, which is the analysis of the existing architecture and how we need to build bridges among the different components of the architecture between the NPT, the CTBT, the ban treaty. Especially because precisely of the states that either left the NPT or they have never become state parties to the NPT, and we need to see how we cover the whole world within some how we cover the whole world into this global nuclear weapons governance. The dialogue is going to, we have to understand that the dialogue is going to take time, and is going to take effort by different stakeholders to contribute with the process in a manner that we can say can be even healing of the wounds that could have been created in the process of pushing the Prohibition Treaty forward. And in that respect, I have been mentioning the need, first of all, to engage academia. Academia should play a very important role in highlighting the components of a new and revitalized agenda that can bring all the countries together. At the same time, I think there is a group of countries that can very well play a role to build a bridge between the different camps and to work with academia to give a new momentum to the disarmament architecture and international politics of disarmament in general. But as I said, I mean, just as we had a political movement that allowed the Prohibition Treaty to to become a reality. We need a political movement for dialogue and in order to revitalize the agenda and the efforts, and to put a little bit more pressure also on the nuclear weapon states. Now as we say in soccer, now the ball is on their field.
Thank you.
One of the problems, Tracy, is that a number of the nuclear weapon states are not, in the words of one P5 ambassador, yet in a healing trajectory, that they're not ready for it. This is what we were told at a conference not long ago. And so, a fundamental question is, when will they, in fact, be able to put behind them this treaty that they didn't like, and to move forward? And I don't think we have a very good answer. We'll find out perhaps a little bit more at the next NPT PrepCom. Kyle?
Hello, my name is Kyle Paludi. I am also a student here in the Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies program. My question actually revolves around the negotiation process. So obviously there were a number of states that were not present and did not participate in the negotiations, but among those who were and were sort of fully committed to the actual sort of creation of this treaty, were there any certain sort of sticking points that throughout the process you thought were like, oh, this actually could, make it so we don't meet our deadline, or you weren't sure if you were going to kind of find something to appease everyone?
Thank you, Kyle. And you have to give a short answer here too, because we've got lots of
yes,
people
okay.
here. I mean, it's a very good question, and I'm sure the ambassador could speak at length about these various points of contention that she had to deal with. I don't know how you want to respond.
Well, the issue of the article on safeguards was let's say a contentious one, as well as the inclusion of other prohibitions that finally did not make it to the text. For instance, the prohibition of transit or financing of nuclear weapons. That was and further refining testing, the prohibition on testing, so that it includes other kinds of testing that are not included in the CTBT, I would say, in general terms. And of course, the issue of withdrawal, the withdrawal clause.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to take the next four questions. Maybe we'll take all four of them, and then the ambassador can choose to, how she wants to respond. I'm just sensitive to the time here, but why don't we start, Paco? You want to ask your question, and then we'll go back and forth and wrap up.
Good evening, and thank you for your talk, Ambassador. I'm Francisco Parada, Paco. I'm from Mexico. And my question is as your experience as chair, how did you manage to maintain the expectations and the negotiations dynamic without having key states such as nuclear weapon states or umbrella states? Thank you.
Thank you, Paco. Victoria?
Hi, my name is Veronica. I'm also in the NPTS program and in Dr. Potter's simulation class. As a inherent pessimist Austrian, my question is, since the NPT has had issues in achieving universalization, how are you hoping to gain universalization in this new treaty? Since the goal is to have the total elimination of weapons, you need universalization. So how are you trying to achieve that, and what is the time component? Because in our simulation it came up oftentimes that not having a clear set goal, a time frame of achieving this, is kind of frustrating and problematic.
Thanks, Veronica. Here's Julia.
Hi, my name is Julia Diamond. I was one of the interns supporting the ban treaty effort.
I'm going to pick the mic up, okay?
Yeah. I was among others, two others here who were supporting the ban treaty effort, and it was a great honor to do so. My question is about your vision of the future in terms of global zero and how the states who are quite firm right now in saying that they will never support the ban treaty, how exactly you see them being incorporated into this treaty. I know that there's a clause for their incorporation, but obviously they are not interested in that at all right now.
Thanks, Julia. Alain?
Hello, Ambassador. My name is Alan Ponce from Mexico as well. I'm a dual degree student between MGIMO and MIS. And my question is related on what should be the priorities for those states that intend to become parties to the nuclear ban treaty. Should they be more focused on strengthening the letter of the treaty, like during the first conference of states parties, or should they start trying to build the institution that this treaty represents? And also, I wanted to know your opinion. Since last week, the Russian ambassador to the United States visited MIS, and he has a specific comment on the nuclear ban treaty, and I would like to quote that it's impossible, useless, and we never support that idea. What would be your opinion on that matter?
Thanks, Alain. Good luck upon your return to Moscow. Sam?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and congratulations for everything you and the conference were able to achieve. My question is, what steps are you taking to induce more countries that are not currently signatories to sign the ban treaty? And maybe in a more specific sense, is being a member of the treaty incompatible with being in an alliance with a nuclear weapons state? For example, if Norway were to decide tomorrow that they wanted to sign the treaty, could they simultaneously sign the treaty and be a member in good standing of NATO? Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, lots of good probing questions here. I'm glad that Ambassador Whyte is the target of those questions. So, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Let's see. During the negotiations, I think the most important contribution by civil society was precisely to keep the momentum going and keep the expectations. I don't think they would have allowed the delegations to lower the energy and the impetus of the negotiations. I think some of the following questions deal with an aspect that we were actually discussing about on a more informal level. What next? After the treaty was signed, what next? How do we achieve universalization? How do we go about the strengthening of the regime, of the treaty as a regime? How do we engage in the political process so that we achieve universalization? I forgot the last question, actually. From my point of view, the process that follows is a process that has two dimensions. One dimension is to strengthen, is an internal dimension of the regime, is to strengthen the political process, to re-establish, to put it that way, to re-establish the communication channels among all the players that actually move the issue forward of the Prohibition Treaty, so that we can start organizing the discussion that is going to take place at the first meeting of state parties, to operationalize many of the concepts that were included in the treaty as obligations. but not necessarily were developed in terms of method or methodology. So that reflection process needs to continue so that we don't see the same process that we have seen in other treaties that has been the case. For example, with the Arms Trade Treaty, that when you negotiated the treaty and it came into force, and all of a sudden you are faced with the first meeting of Conference of State Parties, and you do not have a strategic reflection about how to implement the treaty. So it takes a long time, and it really lowers the energy and the discussion. Then delegations change, and you lose a lot of knowledge. So I think it is very important to use, as opposed to what happened in that process, is to use this period of time between the signature and the actual entry into force to continue the discussion and to continue informing the discussion that of all the work that the meeting of state parties will have to develop. And I think I see a very important role in experts in academia, in CNS and all academia that has been engaged in this process, because part of the potentiality of the treaty to grow also will be linked to the possibility of strengthening the regime at the internal level. So it is very important to organize the discussion so that we have a structured way forward and continue on the reflections. I think something that is probably going to happen soon is to see some sort of a pilot exercise, a pilot project in which one can envision what would happen if a nuclear weapon state came in 2021 and say, okay, here's my proposal for the elimination of my nuclear programs, and I want to become a state party, and I want to sign, and so on and so forth. So that would trigger a lot of processes that were indicated in the treaty and that need to be further developed in different mechanisms. So I think that is going to happen soon. Let's see. That I think would answer the issue of the priorities. I think, as I said, the issue of keeping the discussion and informing and preparing for the first meeting of state parties is vital. The other dimension that I see in this juncture is how the treaty or the political movement that led to the Prohibition Treaty relates to the rest of the architecture, meaning how the same players relate to the NPT and how they engage in the NPT and the FMCT and the CTBT and all the acronyms, and I mean all the components of the architecture that are alive and working, and then we need to reinvigorate and strengthen. So you will see, that is my understanding, that you will see there will be perhaps even more enthusiasm on the part of the proponents of the Prohibition Treaty to engage in those processes, and then say in the more traditional components of the architecture, and that is going to bring perhaps a scenario is that will bring more assurance, that will help build bridges, and it will help in the healing process that is going to take time. But I think by seeing the proponents of the Prohibition Treaty being constructively engaged in the rest of the architecture will actually pave the road towards the healing process.
The one I don't want to let you quite get away without responding to Sam Meyer's question, because I think it is an important and also a difficult one. This was the last question that asked, about really the compatibility of being and remaining NATO alliance partner and also joining the Prohibition Treaty. Do you see those as incompatible, compatible? Because it is a real issue as you talk about expanding the membership in the treaty.
I think I would not like to give a word that can discourage further reflection, further analysis of that, but I think there is room for analysis in terms of what the role of that country is in that alliance and how that country is relating to, is it participating in nuclear planning processes, how this country is relating to the nuclear deterrence responses in general terms. I think, and this is something that some countries are starting to like Japan, for instance, are starting to understand that this is something that will need further analysis, and they're trying to engage experts that share different views so that they can actually analyze what we call in Spanish the small letter of the treaty and the compatibility of their engagement in the alliance with all, disaggregating the different components of that engagement and seeing each component of that engagement vis-a-vis the prohibitions in the ban treaty. I think that is something that I would not like to give an answer at this moment, because I would say absolutely no, and it is incompatible. But I think there is a lot of analysis that can be done and can help these countries to further disaggregate the different components of the discussion. That's my belief.
Thank you. So I think we have come to the bewitching hour. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to join me in expressing our appreciation to our distinguished speaker. I also want to offer you, Elayne, the opportunity to return to Monterey after the treaty enters into force. Hopefully that will be sooner rather than later. And we would be delighted to kind of celebrate its entry upon your return. I think this has really been an unusual opportunity for us to engage with you on topics that are really relevant, to use an overused word. But I think as you gathered from the questions from many of our students and staff members, that these are topics that we are giving a lot of thought to. And hopefully, not only will we be able to ask many difficult questions, but we'll also be able to provide some answers that may assist you and other diplomats to address these vital questions. So please join me in expressing our appreciation to our distinguished speakers.
Thank you.